Speaking of the partition in itself, in all 14 million people were displaced from their homes and up to 2 million died. And along with the fact that we got a British architect, Sir Cyril Radcliffe, to drop the boundary lines, it makes me want to believe that the very act of partition was ill-planned and done in complete haste. And I'm not even going to get started on the mess in Kashmir. From the Indian perspective, having done my math, only 66% of Indian Muslims actually made up West Indies Pakistan in 1947. Over a third, around 35.25% of the total Muslim population chose to stay back in India. But if Jinnah and co posited that Muslims would be underrepresented in an undivided India, they were surely going to be now. In the most ideal of worst cases where partition was an inevitability, the least the leaders on both sides could have done is to make sure there was a clean sorting of Muslims on one side and non-Muslims on the other. Because one cannot help but admit that whatever beef Hindus and Muslims had with one another prior to 1947, the partition only made it worse in the decades to come on either side of the border. I can only imagine how deeply frustrating and heartbreaking it must have been for the majority of the people who fought so hard and knowing their fellow countrymen had laid down their lives in sacrifice so that we could live to be free, to see it get sliced to pieces. Most of us did not want this and given a choice would rather live in a free undivided India. So, going back to the original question, in the generations following the partition, strictly from an Indian perspective, because of the long history of Persian invasions in India, Muslims were always seen as outsiders. The Mughal Empire managed to bring it down to an extent by accepting this land as their own, but xenophobia and negative stereotypes against people of Islamic faith had always been around for centuries, but partition only made it worse. For a brief period in the early 20th century, the people of India had got a taste of how real unity and oneness feels like when the entire nation, irrespective of race, religion or gender, collectively fought against British oppression as one being, especially after the Jallianwala Bagh massacre that shook the nation out of its slumber. But when the Muslim League demanded a separate nation and got their way, the rest of us naturally felt betrayed. That resentment was wrongfully directed by some in the form of mistrust and hatred towards the few Muslims who chose to remain loyal to their original motherland. People wanted someone to blame, and the ones who remained were easy targets. Islam got the reputation of a faith that does not compromise, neither will fit into society but instead try to create their own society. The rise of radical Islamic militancy and terrorism, particularly in Kashmir, has not helped their case at all. I'm not proud of this part of my country's history and current reality, but it is what it is. Even today, most Muslims in India live in ghettos and in poverty. If they try to raise a voice against injustice, they are mocked and asked, so why didn't they go to Pakistan? If Jinnah or Iqbal were alive today, they would probably say, I told you so. Cow vigilantes in interior India harassing and lynching those who consume beef is an occurrence that happens more often than can be ignored. In the crudest of examples, every time there is a cricket match between India and Pakistan, the Indian Muslim feels the pressure to prove his or her loyalty to the Indian cricket team, which is sad, to be honest. Nobody deserves to live a life in constant fear and insecurity in their own country. But then, minority discrimination has marred civilization throughout history and continues to do so all over the world. That does not make it okay, however. But having said that, these incidents and occurrences are few and far in between compared to the size of India's population and landmass. India has made a conscious effort to remain a secular country we promised ourselves we would be in our constitution. Every major holiday of every religion is observed. Eid and Christmas may not be as big as Holi and Diwali, but it is still celebrated by everybody. For a country that only has 14.2%, 2.3% and 1.7% of its population following the faith of Islam, Christianity and Sikhism respectively, Muslims, Christians and Sikhs sure have found representation in all walks and professions, be it in academics, armed forces, public services, sport, art, music, movies or politics. But I digress. India as a nation still has a long way to go. Communal tension is merely one of the many problems it faces right now, and the struggle to overcome is very much on. To answer the second part of the question as to how those around me were affected by the partition, honestly, we weren't. It is important to realize that India had a population of 430 million in 1947, of which only 3% of the people were actually affected by the partition, most of them concentrated in Punjab and Bengal. I come from the southwest coast of India. My family and ancestors were more affected by the Portuguese operation in Goa than the British and the entire Hindu-Muslim partition saga that followed, but that is a topic for another day. In conclusion, did partition serve its purpose? No. If 1937 was a Congress versus Muslim League power grab with Britain being the third party benefactor, present day it is India versus Pakistan with the third parties being China, USA and the like. Nothing much has changed post the original Brexit of 1947. Could we have avoided the 4 wars that were needlessly fought over the past 6 decades? Maybe. Does it mean the lives, time and resources used up in war and arms deals only meant at intimidating one another could have been instead used to provide food, infrastructure and education to all on either side of the border? Hell yeah. Sure, I realize there is no going back and we must learn to accept that. But if the whole point of history is to remind us of our mistakes, learn from them and never repeat them again, I think we are going wrong somewhere and we need to look at how we should fix that. I shall continue to remain hopeful. Also, contrary to media perception and internet trolls, the fact is the common man in India and Pakistan alike does not hate one another. All said and done, we still are essentially the same people divided by an imaginary line drawn by a white dude, and that, my friend, is the story of partition summed up in one sentence.
That is one big pile of shit.